She was 18 years old, with $4.60 to her name, when the men from the bank set her father's chair out on the frozen boardwalk and locked the door behind her. Elias Grieve, who held the town's mortgages the way other men held grudges, said the debt was old, and the law was plain, and that was the end of it. What she had left in the world fit inside a flour sack and a coat pocket, $4.60, a tin of her mother's buttons, and a dog. So when the auctioneer in Amity Creek stood over a blackened, half-collapsed smokehouse nobody else would bid on and called out, "Do I hear $1?" she raised her hand before she had time to think better of it, because it was the only building in town as abandoned and unwanted as she now felt herself to be. Beside her, pressed warm against her skirts, stood the only creature who had not left her, a rust-colored hound named Copper, ears already lifting toward the smokehouse's blackened door, as though he had caught the scent of something the rest of the world had forgotten was there. She did not know it yet, but that dollar would call up a secret sealed inside those charred walls for 20 years, a secret that would not just save her, but pay back an old and patient debt the whole town didn't know it was owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hartwell and her faithful dog Copper. If this story warms something in you, tell us in the comments where you're settling in from tonight. We love knowing who's here with us by the fire. Before she was the girl who bought a ruined smokehouse for a single silver dollar, Josephine Hartwell was simply Josie, the smokehouse master's daughter, and in the small, hard-working town of Amity Creek, Montana Territory, that was a name that opened doors. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, had built his trade the way he built everything, slowly, honestly, and with his hands smelling permanently of hickory and salt. He had come west as a young man with nothing but a cart, a barrel of salt, and a recipe for curing meat that had been in his family for 3 generations, and he had built, board by board, a modest smokehouse at the edge of town that fed half of Amity Creek through its long winters. Josie's earliest memories were not of dolls or ribbons, but of the low amber light inside the curing house. Her father's voice explaining which woods gave sweetness and which gave bite, how salt drew out what would spoil a thing, and left behind only what would keep it. Her mother, Ruth, had died of a lung fever when Josie was 7, a loss that hollowed something in the house that never quite filled back in, but it also meant that Josie grew up at her father's elbow rather than at a mother's hearth, learning a trade most girls in the territory were never taught. She learned to read a hog's fat the way other women read a hymnal, to judge smoke by its color and its smell, to know that patience was not a virtue you were born with, but one you built, slowly, the way you built a proper cure, nothing rushed, nothing false, nothing thrown together to look right before it was right. Her father used to say that a smokehouse was a kind of promise. You put something imperfect and perishable inside it, and if you were patient and honest with it, time and care turned it into something that could feed a family through the worst of winter. He said it about meat, but Josie came to understand, much later, that he had also been saying it about people. It was in the spring of her 12th year that Copper came into her life, though at the time he was barely more than a shivering handful of matted fur that had wandered, half-starved, into the yard behind the smokehouse, drawn no doubt by the smell of curing bacon that clung to every board of the place. Thomas Hartwell was not a sentimental man about much, but he took one look at the trembling pup, its ribs like the slats of a barrel, and told Josie to fetch it a bowl of scraps before it fell over dead in his yard. The dog did not leave after that meal, or the one after, and within a month he had appointed himself the permanent shadow of the smokehouse and everyone who worked in it, sleeping across the threshold at night, as though he had elected himself its guardian. Josie named him Copper for the reddish cast of his coat, somewhere between a hound and a farm dog and something wilder besides, and from the first week he showed a nose that even her father admired, able to find a dropped scrap of meat buried under snow, or a rat's den behind the smokehouse wall, faster than any man could with a lantern. But it was not his nose that bound him to Josie so much as his stillness. The way he would lay his head across her feet on the nights after her mother's absence pressed hardest on her. The way he seemed to know, before she did, when a bad day was coming, and would simply lean the solid warmth of himself against her side until it passed. Her father used to joke that he had raised 2 apprentices in that smokehouse, one who could smell a proper cure from across the yard, and one who could smell sorrow from across a room, and he was never sure which of them had learned the trade better. By the time Josie was 16, she could run the smokehouse alone for a week at a stretch, when her father traveled to buy hogs, salt, and hickory, and the townsfolk had stopped remarking on the sight of a girl doing a smokemaster's work, because by then, it was simply understood. The Hartwells fed Amity Creek, father and daughter both, and the dog watched over all of it. Her father raised her on more than curing meat though. He raised her on the particular creed of a man who had once been poor himself and never forgot it. That you fed the hungry man before you asked whether he could pay. That you kept a ledger of debts in pencil, not ink, so that hard winters could be forgiven without shame on either side. That the whole purpose of building something that lasted, like a proper cure, was so it could be shared out when others had nothing put by of their own. He told her once, turning a rack of ribs in the low smoke, that Amity Creek had been founded on exactly that idea, generations before either of them arrived, by a butcher and provisioner named Silas Vance, a man whose name was still spoken with a strange, careful respect in town, though nobody Josie ever met could say precisely why. Old Silas Vance, her father said, had built the very smokehouse that would one day become the ruin she bought for $1, and it was said, though only ever in the tone people use for stories they are not certain are true, that Vance had set aside something for the town's hard years, some provision meant to outlast him, before he vanished in a fire that took the original building down to its foundation stones some 20 years past. Nothing had ever been found. Most people in town had long since decided that whatever Vance intended to leave behind, if it ever existed at all, had burned with him, or had been carried off by his own hand before the fire, and the ruin at the edge of town had stood condemned and shunned ever since. A place children dared each other to run past at dusk. Josie listened to these stories the way she listened to most town gossip, with half an ear, never once suspecting that she would spend her 18th winter with her hand pressed flat against those same blackened timbers, or that the dog asleep at her feet that very evening would be the one to prove the story true. The fall, when it came, did not come as a single blow, but as a slow tightening, the way a rope tightens around a wrist that has stopped fighting it. 2 years before the auction, Thomas Hartwell had borrowed against the smokehouse to replace a failed roof, and to see the business through a summer when half the territory's hogs sickened and died before slaughter, and the note he signed was held by Amity Creek's only bank, which had passed, the year before, into the hands of a sharp-eyed newcomer named Elias Grieve. Grieve had arrived in town with capital nobody asked too many questions about, and within 18 months he owned, outright or through debt, more of Amity Creek than the mayor and the church combined. He was not, by the town's estimation, a cruel man in the way of raised voices or open threats. He was worse, in the quiet way of men who let paper do their cruelty for them, adjusting interest here, calling a note due there. Always within the letter of a law he had a hand in writing himself as a member of the town council. Thomas Hartwell fell ill that winter, with a wasting cough that the town doctor could not name and could not cure, and as his strength went, so did his ability to run the smokehouse at the pace the note required, and Josie watched her father spend his last strong months not resting, as he should have, but hauling wood and salt himself, rather than let his daughter shoulder debts he felt were his alone to carry. He died in the deep cold of February, 3 weeks before his 18th birthday came for his only child, and he died, Josie was almost certain, still believing he had bought her time. He had not. Elias Grieve called the note due within the month, citing a clause about the transfer of the property upon the borrower's death, that Thomas Hartwell, in his illness, had either not read closely, or not had the strength to argue. Josie stood in the bank's front office in a black dress 2 sizes too large, borrowed from a neighbor for the funeral, and listened to Grieve explain in a voice of practiced and terrible patience, that a girl of her age could not legally hold a business note in the territory without a male guarantor, that the smokehouse and the house behind it were forfeit to the bank, and that he was in fact being generous in allowing her 3 days to gather her belongings before the property was sold to settle the debt. There was no one to argue for her. Her father's few living relations were a married sister in Ohio, who had not written in a decade, and the men of the town who might have spoken up owed Grieve too much of their own to risk his displeasure on a smokemaster's orphaned daughter. She packed what fit in a flour sack: her mother's buttons, her father's cure book with its brittle, handwritten pages, a shawl, a knife, and little else. And on the morning the bank's men came to change the locks, Copper walked out beside her, without being called, as though he had already understood there was nothing left inside worth guarding. She took a room above the mercantile, that the widow Pettibone let her have for almost nothing out of pity and old friendship with her father, and she counted what remained of the household's coin down to the last cent, $4.60, and a dog who would not leave her side even to eat until she had eaten first. It was 2 weeks later, in a raw wind that cut through even her father's old coat, that she heard the courthouse crier calling out a tax auction of condemned properties on the far edge of town, unwanted parcels the county wanted off its books before the new year, and among the names read out, almost as an afterthought, was the old Vance Smokehouse ruin. Nobody bid. The auctioneer, a tired man eager to be done and inside by a fire, called for $1 as a formality more than an expectation, and Josie, standing at the back of the small crowd with Copper's leash wound twice around her cold hand, heard herself say, "Here," before she had weighed the wisdom of it at all. It was foolish, she knew even as she said it. $1 was nearly a quarter of everything she owned, spent on a burned-out ruin that had stood condemned and empty for 2 decades, that half the town crossed the street to avoid after dark. But there was something in her, some stubborn thread inherited from a father who built things others had given up on, that could not let a forgotten, blackened building be auctioned off for nothing without at least looking at what it might still be. She paid her $1, took the deed in her own name, since no banknote or male guarantor was required for condemned land nobody else wanted, and walked with Copper down the frozen lane to see, for the first time in her life, what exactly she had bought. The Vance Smokehouse stood at the edge of Amity Creek, where the town gave way to scrub pine, its roof caved in on the north side, its walls scorched black in long streaks that still, 20 years on, told the story of the fire that had taken it. Half the structure was open to the sky, filled with drifted snow, and the skeletons of old smoking racks, but the south end had somehow survived nearly whole, its thick stone foundation and hand-hewn beams too stubborn to fully burn, and it was toward this surviving corner that Copper strained the moment they stepped through the sagging doorway, nose working, tail gone rigid and low in the particular way Josie had learned. Over 6 years of watching him work a smokehouse floor meant he had found something worth finding. She let him lead her, picking her way over fallen timber and ash-crusted snow, until he stopped before the old curing pit set into the stone floor of the south room, a deep, brick-lined hearth, where Silas Vance would once have smoked his hams and sides of bacon, and there, Copper began to dig and scratch at the packed ash and frozen earth in its base with a single-minded fury she had never seen in him before, even as a starving pup. She knelt beside him more out of habit than expectation, brushing away ash with her bare, cold fingers, and felt beneath the layer of debris not the dirt floor she expected, but something harder, flatter, deliberately laid, a slab of fitted stone, subtly different from the rest of the hearth, with a thin dark seam running along one edge that did not belong to any natural crack. Her heart began to beat strangely fast. She looked at Copper, who had stopped digging, and now sat rigid and alert at the edge of the stone, watching her with the same steady attention he gave a smoking rack he was guarding from thieving barn cats, and she understood, with a certainty she could not have explained to another living soul, that her dog had just found something that mattered. It took her the better part of 2 days, working in stolen hours, before and after the small jobs of mending and washing she now took in to survive, to clear enough ash and frozen dirt from around the stone slab to see its true edges, and even then she could not move it alone. It was Copper who, on the second afternoon, solved what her strength could not, worming his nose, and then his whole foreleg into a gap at the slab's corner that her fingers had been too thick to widen, scrabbling at the loosened dirt beneath it, until the stone shifted, groaned, and tipped up on some hidden hinge or pivot point that had clearly been built into the hearth by careful, patient hands 20 years before. Beneath it was not simply a hollow, as she had half expected, but a narrow stone-lined chamber, dry despite the decades, holding a single iron-banded strongbox no larger than a hat-box, its lock rusted, but its wood and iron sound, and beside it, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept the damp entirely out, a thin leather ledger book, and a sealed letter addressed, in a strong old-fashioned hand, to whoever should one day stand where she now knelt. She sat back on her heels in the cold, ash-streaked and shaking, with her hand resting on Copper's head as much to steady her own nerves as to praise him, and understood that whatever this was, it was no accident of fire or forgetting. Someone had built this vault on purpose, sealed it with care, and waited 20 years for someone honest enough, or desperate enough, to find it. She did not open the strongbox that first night. Her hands shook too badly with cold and disbelief, and some instinct in her, the same one her father had trained into her at every stage of a proper cure, told her that a thing sealed with such patience deserved to be opened with equal care, rather than torn into by firelight in a half-ruined building. She carried the ledger and the letter back to her room above the mercantile, hidden beneath her coat, and left the strongbox itself buried again beneath a loose board she wedged over the pit, trusting Copper, who lay across the smokehouse threshold that night, as he had once guarded her father's curing racks, to raise the alarm if anyone else came near. By lamplight, with the dog's head heavy and warm across her feet, she broke the brittle wax seal on the letter, and began to read the words of Silas Vance himself, written, by the date at its top, mere weeks before the fire that was supposed to have ended his story. He wrote of founding Amity Creek's provisioning trade, not for his own profit alone, but as a promise to the families who had come west with him, and nearly starved their first winter before he learned to properly cure and store meat through the cold months. He wrote of setting aside, every good year, a portion of his profit into what he called the Founder's Provision, a fund meant to be quietly loaned or given, in hard winters, to whichever families needed it most, administered in secret, so that no proud man need feel the shame of charity. He wrote, in a hand that grew visibly less steady toward the letter's end, that he had discovered, in the weeks before the fire, that a man on the town council, he did not commit the name to paper, as though even then he feared who might read it, had been quietly forging debts against half the town's smallholders, intending to seize their land once winter forced them into default, and that he, Vance, intended to expose the scheme and use the Founder's Provision to pay off the false debts before the councilman could act. The fire came 3 nights after that letter was dated. Silas Vance was never seen alive again, and the town, told only that he had died in the blaze trying to save his ledgers, quietly buried both the man and the truth of what he had been about to do. The ledger told the rest in careful columns. 2 decades of contributions to the Founder's Provision. Family names Josie recognized as her neighbors' grandparents and great-uncles, sums lent and quietly repaid, and on its final pages, in the same failing hand as the letter, a list of the very families whose debts Vance had discovered were fraudulent, cross-referenced against a set of names on the town council of that era, the very same council whose banking interests, Josie realized with a cold, creeping understanding, had passed down, one careful marriage, and one quiet inheritance at a time, into the hands of Elias Grieve. She sat with that knowledge, long into the night, Copper's steady breathing, the only sound in the room, and understood that she was no longer holding a curiosity, dug out of an old ruin. She was holding the truth about the very man who had put her out onto a frozen boardwalk 2 weeks before, and the proof, 20 years buried, that his fortune had been built on exactly the same fraud he was still practicing on families like her own. Word travels fast in a small town, faster still when it concerns a smokehouse everyone thought was cursed, and it was not more than a week before Elias Grieve himself came calling on the girl he had evicted, standing in the mercantile's front room with his hat in his hand, and a smile that did not reach his eyes, inquiring with elaborate casualness whether Miss Hartwell had found anything of interest in her little purchase. Josie, who had inherited more of her father's steadiness than she knew, told him only that she had found an old curing pit and some rotted timber, and watched something flicker behind Grieve's careful expression that told her, more surely than any confession could have, that he already suspected what she had truly found, and that he had likely been waiting 20 years himself for someone to dig deep enough into that hearth to find it before he could. He offered, with the same false warmth, to buy the ruin back from her for $10, a sum so absurdly generous for a burned-out shell that half the mercantile's customers turned to stare, and when Josie declined, politely but with a firmness she borrowed from memories of her father refusing bad trades, Grieve's warmth cooled into something harder around the eyes before he settled his hat and left without another word. Within days, the whispers began that the Hartwell girl was meddling with cursed ground, that strange things had always happened around that ruin, that decent folk ought not deal with her lest whatever misfortune took Silas Vance find them too, and Josie understood, watching neighbors who had known her father for 20 years suddenly cross the street to avoid her, that Grieve was doing exactly what her father had once explained he did best, letting fear and paper do his fighting for him. The pressure came from other directions too, more dangerous than gossip. A county surveyor arrived unannounced to reassess her condemned parcel, hinting that new fire safety codes might require the whole ruin razed to the ground within the month at her own expense, an expense she plainly could not pay, which would force her either to abandon the deed, or fall into exactly the kind of debt Grieve specialized in collecting. One evening, two men she did not recognize, hired hands by the look of their unfamiliar coats and the way they lingered without buying anything at the mercantile, walked slow circles around the smokehouse at dusk, testing the door and peering through the gaps in the scorched boards, until Copper's low, steady bark from the threshold sent them back down the lane before they found reason to come closer. Josie understood then that whatever waited beneath that hearth was worth more to Elias Grieve than $10 or even $100, and that the only safety left to her was in moving faster than his patience, not in matching it. It was Copper, again, who gave her the courage to hold her ground during the worst of it, refusing to let strangers near the smokehouse without announcing himself, standing between Josie and the surveyor's clipboard-waving assistant with a low, steady growl, until the man retreated to his buggy, and simply lying each night against her feet with the same patient, unshaken loyalty he had shown through every loss she had suffered that winter, as if to remind her that not everything in Amity Creek had turned its back on the Hartwells. She realized, turning Silas Vance's ledger over by lamplight night after night, matching its faded names against families she still saw at church and at market, that she held in her hands not just proof of an old crime, but the means to undo a new one, and that the only way through Grieve's pressure was not to hide the vault deeper, as her fear urged her, but to bring its truth into daylight before he could bury it a second time. She chose the town meeting held each month in the church hall, the one civic gathering in Amity Creek that even Elias Grieve, as a council member, was obligated to attend, and she chose to bring with her not lawyers or allies, for she had neither, but the ledger, the letter, and Copper walking calm and steady at her heel, as he had through every hard week of that winter. She stood before neighbors who had, some of them, been avoiding her for a month, and read aloud Silas Vance's own words about the founder's provision, and the fraud he had uncovered, just before the fire that ended his life, and then she read the names from his final ledger page, and watching the color drain from faces in the crowd as they recognized their own grandparents, their own family debts, laid out in a stranger's careful hand from 20 years past, debts that matched, with damning precision, the very mortgages and liens that Elias Grieve's bank still held over half those same families today. Grieve rose to object, to call it forgery, to demand she be removed for slandering a respected institution, and it was in that moment, with the hall in an uproar, and Josie's voice nearly failing her, that Copper did what he had done from the very first night at the Smokehouse. He simply stood, planted himself at Josie's side, and would not be moved, a small stubborn anchor of calm that steadied her enough to finish what she had come to say. That she did not ask the town to take her word for any of it, only to send for the strong box itself, still sealed, still sitting exactly where 20 years of ash and silence had left it, and to open it together, in front of everyone, so that no one man could ever again decide alone what truth Amity Creek was allowed to know. They brought the strongbox to the church hall the following evening, carried between two of the town's oldest and most respected farmers, rather than by Josie alone, so that no one could later claim it had been tampered with, and it was pried open under lantern light in front of nearly the whole of Amity Creek. Inside was not the fortune in gold that rumor had built the ruin into over 20 years of ghost stories, but something in its way more valuable, a modest sum in silver dollars, carefully saved rather than hoarded, a deed to a strip of common land Silas Vance had set aside for a town relief house he never lived to build, and a final, notarized accounting, witnessed by the county clerk of that era, of exactly which council members had been forging debts against smallholders in the months before the fire, an accounting that named, in ink 20 years dry, the young clerk who had gone on to become the grandfather whose fortune and methods Elias Grieve had inherited along with his bank. The hall did not explode into anger, so much as into a long terrible silence, the particular quiet of a town realizing it had misjudged a dead man's memory for 2 decades, while quietly enriching the family who had wronged him. Grieve tried, for a few desperate minutes, to argue the documents were too old to matter, that no court in the territory would act on decades-dead fraud, but the county clerk's own grandson, present that night, and mortified to find his family's old ledgers implicated, confirmed the notarization was genuine, and within a week, a territorial circuit judge, summoned by a town suddenly unified in its outrage, had opened a formal inquiry into the bank's foreclosure practices going back 3 generations. Grieve's own current year debts against smallholders, including the note that had put Josie out onto the boardwalk in the first place, were found, upon proper audit, to include the same padded interest and forged renewal clauses his grandfather had pioneered, and the circuit court voided them outright, restoring clear title to a dozen families across the county, Josie's own Smokehouse land included, this time free of any bank's claim at all. The silver in Vance's strongbox, once the court had finished its accounting, was not so large a sum that it could enrich any one person, and Josie, standing again before that same church hall a month later, made certain it never would. She proposed instead, with the county clerk and the town's minister as witnesses, that the money and the deeded common land be used exactly as Silas Vance had intended 20 years before, as the seed of a true founder's provision, a standing fund the town itself would oversee, to help families through failed harvests and hard winters, without the shame or the risk of a private note held over their heads by any single man again. The town voted for it without a single dissenting voice. Elias Grieve, having quietly sold his interest in the bank, and left the territory within the month, rather than face the circuit judge's continued inquiry into 3 generations of his family's dealings. Josie rebuilt the Vance Smokehouse herself that spring, board by board, much as her father had built his own years before, salvaging what timber the fire had spared, and adding new beams where it had not, until by midsummer smoke curled once more from a chimney that had stood cold and blackened for 20 years, and the smell of hickory and curing meat drifted again over the edge of Amity Creek. She ran it not as the Hartwell Smokehouse, nor the Vance Smokehouse, but simply as the town's provision house, open to any family in a hard season, its ledger kept in pencil, just as her father had once taught her, so that debts of necessity could always be forgiven without shame. Copper, Gray, now beginning to show faintly at his muzzle, took up the same post at the threshold that he had held at her father's smokehouse years before, guardian once more of a place built to feed people, rather than to profit from their hunger. It is worth remembering, at the end of a story like this one, that the girl who stood on a frozen boardwalk with $4.60 and a dog was not lucky so much as she was patient, honest, and willing to look closely at a thing everyone else had already decided was worthless. The smokehouse she bought for a single dollar was not truly a ruin at all, only a promise that had been sealed up and waiting 20 years for someone with the character to honor it, rather than plunder it. And it took a dog's honest nose, uncorrupted by rumor or fear, to find what a whole town's gossip had walked past for 2 decades, without ever once digging deeper. Silas Vance had built his founder's provision on the belief that the truest wealth a community could hold was not gold locked in a vault, but the quiet, ongoing willingness of neighbors to see each other through hard winters without shame. And it was fitting, in the end, that it took another orphaned, nearly penniless soul to finally deliver on that promise, with nothing to recommend her but a father's teaching and a dog who would not stop digging. Josephine Hartwell never did become a wealthy woman by the standards of the territory, but she became, as her father had once been, someone whose door was never locked to a hungry neighbor, and she kept, tucked always in her apron pocket, the small tin of her mother's buttons that had once been nearly all she owned, a reminder of exactly how little it had taken, and exactly how much it had returned. Thank you for settling in with us tonight, and walking this long road with Josephine and her faithful dog Copper all the way to its ending. If their story moved something in you, we would be so glad if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that patience and honesty still count for something in this world, and left us a comment telling us which moment stayed with you longest. We'll leave you with the same question Josie herself might have asked, staring into that old smoking pit by lamplight. What is it in your own life that everyone else has already given up on, that might only be waiting for someone patient enough to look closer?